Tonight on Nation to Nation, the Federal Court of Appeal halted the Trans Mountain Pipeline, at least for the moment, ruling that Ottawa didn't properly consult First Nations.
Everyone's enthusiastic about this pipeline. This is a pipeline that we've said is in the national interest, but that doesn't mean we can't circumvent our constitutional duties to consult Indigenous peoples.
But how can Ottawa consult on something it insists will move forward?
If you have decided already, you can hardly call these consultations from the constitutional perspective and obligations and duties of the Crown.
And for some, enough consulting. Just build it.
And it sounds like the government wants to go back to square one. They want to consult about consulting to decide how they're going to consult.
Welcome to another season of Nation to Nation. I'm your host, Todd Lamourant. When we last had our panel of MPs on the show, the topic of discussion was the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion. 4 months later, and we begin with the same thing, except there's been a Federal Court of Appeal decision that put the brakes on Trans Mountain. To satisfy that decision, the Liberal government has instructed the National Energy Board to review how tanker traffic impacts marine life. And yesterday, Natural Resources Minister Amarjeet Sohi appointed retired Supreme Court Justice Frank Iacobucci to restart consultations with Indigenous peoples. Now, to discuss this today, I'm joined by the relatively new Parliamentary Secretary for Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller.
Hi, thank you.
The Shadow Minister for Indigenous Affairs for the Conservatives, Cathy McLeod, and NDP MP Romeo Saganash. So before we get started in our panel discussions, I just want to play a short clip from yesterday's press conference.
But that does not mean that if we fulfill our constitutional obligation, that those groups may have a veto to stop this project. That is not our understanding of our obligations to fulfill our constitutional responsibilities to meaningfully consult with Indigenous peoples.
Now, Mr. Miller, I'm going to start with you. From the sounds of what Minister Sohi said yesterday, it sounds like building the pipeline is still a foregone conclusion, and the federal government won't take no as an answer. So how is this still meaningful consultations?
Well, look, what the court case said is that we have to do these Phase 3 consultations with Indigenous peoples in a way that is meaningful and impactful. That wasn't done, and we've acknowledged that and said that we will do it right, we'll take the time to do it right. So part of putting in place a renewed Phase 3 consultation process with 117 First Nations is making sure that we do have an elaborate process where we're actually taking information, bringing it back, and considering it. Everyone's enthusiastic about this pipeline. This is a pipeline that we've said is in the national interest, but that doesn't mean we can't circumvent our constitutional duties to consult Indigenous peoples and have that meaningful conversations. The court said that the government acted in good faith. At the same time, it said the Cabinet did not have the sufficient amount of information, and that those Phase 3 consultations in particular weren't done properly. And that's something that we take quite seriously, and that's why we put Frank Iacobucci, for a former Supreme Court Justice, in place to give us guidance and to lead those consultations and to double the capacity that we had in place previously in order to have the deep, meaningful, impactful consultations with the peoples that are affected by or will be affected by this pipeline.
Mr. Saganash, what do you think about that response?
Well, I have many problems with that response, the Minister's response and Mark's response here. When you have decided already that this pipeline will be built, that is further from what the Federal Court of Appeal has said, in the sense that if you have decided already, you can hardly call these consultations from the constitutional perspective and obligations and duties of the Crown. So this is a farce for me. I think any court in this land will reject that as consultations, in my view.
Ms. McLeod, the appointment of Mr. Iacobucci kind of sounds like what your party leader, Andrew Scheer, proposed a couple of weeks ago. Yet you and Shannon Stubbs put out a statement yesterday questioning the timeline of all this. So why are you questioning this? I mean, if we rush this, won't we just be back in court?
So I think there's a few things. First of all, I think the appointment was certainly a fine appointment, and I think a well-respected former judge is going to be leading this consultation process. So we don't have any discomfort with that. But what we have concerns about is this process started in 2012. there has been a lot of consultation, and it sounds like the government wants to go back to square one. They want to consult about consulting to decide how they're going to consult. I thought the court decision was relatively clear in terms of what they had to do and how they had to move forward. And, you know, quite frankly, when the minister says they're following the court's direction, they're not doing that. They have a path forward. You know, certainly I acknowledge that we've been strong supporters of this pipeline, as well as many of the First Nations in the communities that I represent, who are actually, as we speak, having to redo their budgets, having to redo their planning because they had anticipated community benefits, jobs, and opportunity. So, quite frankly, I think this is going to be, if ever, many, many years before this ever gets built.
Mr. Saganash, a report came out in Post Media just last night about giving the pipeline to First Nations. Is that something you or your party would support?
I mean, I can't even speak to that because every First Nation or every nation in this country have their own decision-making processes, and that's recognized under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The Cree in Northern Quebec make decisions in their own way, as do others in this country, so that's up to them to decide. My problem is that as a parliamentarian, I always have to take a stand on things that oppose the rule of law. And the rule of law means respecting the Constitution. In our Constitution, there are Aboriginal rights, and including the duty to consult and accommodate. That has to be respected. So when the government says repeatedly in the House of Commons, this project is going to be built no matter what, you're not consulting them anymore.
Ms. McLeod, the idea that we talked about giving the pipeline to First Nations, somebody in your backyard, in your constituency, the chief of the Whispering Pines First Nation, supports this idea. I mean, would you get behind this? It would mean shovels getting in the ground sooner?
You know, I think it's not going to make a difference for shovels getting in the ground. I think we're sort of speculating on an unknown source, an unknown report, but I do know that there are First Nations who are very interested in equity partnerships. We know another example, of course, is the Eagle Spirit Energy Project, where really, again, First Nations wanting to benefit from the jobs, the opportunity, the equity partnership. So certainly we support equity partnerships as part of a path forward.
Mr. Miller, this twist in the pipeline sag, is this something that can confirm has been discussed at the cabinet level?
I won't confirm the ultimate ownership of this pipeline. This is something that will come out in due course. I do want to acknowledge the comments, or maybe Ms. McLeod and Mr. Saganash. Clearly there's a divergence of opinion within communities. Different people use those opinions for their own purposes, but Mr. Saganash's view is prevalent. I'll never deny that that doesn't exist in communities. Indeed, Mr. Saganash, for a lot of Indigenous peoples, is a hero, and that view and an example. And so that view exists in those communities, and it comes to the fore, and we have to listen to that. We can't deny that those views. We can't say those views don't exist. At the same time, there are, as Ms. McLeod said, there are Indigenous communities that say we want this to go forward. There are some people with benefit agreements. They're neither for or against it, but they've signed these agreements and they have expectations vis-a-vis the Crown. So for me, it comes back to the honor of the Crown and the way we've been leading these consultations over time. We did inherit a botched process. No one will deny that. It wasn't perfect, the next stage that was taken under the leadership of the current government. At the same time, we've taken the decision to get this right, and we'll take the time that is needed to get it right. Again, does it mean a community has a veto? I think that was discussed or stated quite clearly by Minister Sylvie.
The courts clearly said that the process was okay. They had a good process in place, but what they did was they failed to execute. So, I mean, they love to put out that they had this botched process that they inherited, but that's not actually what the court said. So I just wanted to correct the record on that one.
Okay, well, we could go on and on about this, and we certainly will, I'm sure, as we go forward. But it's time for a break. And when we come back, the panel will still be here, but we'll be talking about the Indigenous Rights Framework Initiative. Welcome back. In fact, there's something even more pressing than pipelines, the Indigenous Rights Framework Initiative. Legislation needs to be tabled in the House of Commons before December to be passed before the next election. Trudeau has said the initiative is about getting out from under the Indian Act, or Canada finally respecting the rights of Indigenous people. Nation to Nation met recently with a senior bureaucrat working on the file to find out what's going on. He said the framework legislation will likely be broken up into two parts: A, to help First Nations become self-governing, and B, then to negotiate what they'll get. Mr. Miller, I'll start with you. The sound of Trudeau's speech last February in the House of Commons, it sounded like this was finally a big redo to get out of the Indian Act, but we heard that there's going to be choice and First Nations can choose to stay under the Indian Act if this gets passed. Why is that?
Well, look, this is a process that has been maturing over some time, and the ultimate goal is to ensure that First Nations have the opportunity for self-government. And now this isn't something that can be decided unilaterally by government. Clearly, this is a two-way path that must be paved with respect. We need to take the time necessary to consult communities, stakeholders, rights holders, to make sure they're aware of the whole package of options available. The guiding theme is ensuring that a colonial framework is stripped in order to ensure that nations can have that opportunity to get out from under it without 15 or 16, 20 years in some cases of negotiation. And so we're conscious of a lot of the challenges. We've seen some of the pushback that we've gotten from the AFN in particular and different people. There are some nations that are very eager to move forward, but that implies a lot of things, considering treaty rights in some circumstances, discussion on inherent rights, fiscal frameworks. There's a lot of moving parts, and there's a lot of apprehension. And so I think what you'll see from this government is we're going to take the time to talk to the people that have those inherent rights and treaty rights and get it right and take the time it takes and not rush things.
Mr. Saganash, of course, last week you famously said that the government doesn't care about Indigenous rights. Isn't this framework initiative a good start, though?
Well, my problem is this. We have the Constitution, Section 35 of the Constitution. We have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We have the jurisprudence stemming, in particular, from the out of the Supreme Court of Canada. We have our treaties. There's a lack of acknowledgement by this government that these are existing legal constitutional frameworks. Why don't we start by respecting those frameworks instead of trying to reinvent the wheel like I think they're attempting to do? I'm not sure where this is going to land, if it ever lands anywhere, but certainly I think we need to start there. Start respecting those legal frameworks that we have in place in this country and move on from there. That's been the problem in my view. And I mean, I'll give my opinion on the legislation once it's tabled, because that's our role as parliamentarians. I recall the moment when Bernard Valcourt tabled his First Nations Control over First Nations Education Act. I was in a house that morning, and I read through the legislation, trying to find where control was. There was the word control was never to be found in that legislation. So, and I'll do the same with this new framework legislation that's being promised.
Ms. MacLeod, you've heard two opinions, I guess, on this. I guess where does the Conservatives fall on this?
I think what is happening is typical in terms of what the Liberal government has done. They've made significant commitments to Indigenous peoples in Canada, and they continually fail to meet deadlines, follow through. If you look back to S3, the Gender Equity Act, I mean, they were going to have a rapid consultation after we passed S3. Where is it? Where is the resolution? So we've consistently heard promises, and I think it's terribly disturbing and unfair to, overpromise and underdeliver. It's just happened too often.
Of course, we got one more year. The deadline is the next election. If there was a change in government and Andrew Scheer became the Prime Minister, is this something you would support?
You know, I think these talks have mostly been in secret, so we have no idea. We haven't seen the legislation, as Mr. Saganash has said. We have no idea what's happening in these talks behind closed doors. So I think, you know, obviously we're going to have to look at what's happening at the time and really, and where they're at. And certainly from watching what was happening at the AFN, there was a whole lot of concerns expressed. So I wasn't getting the feeling that there was good support in terms of what was happening.
And same things happening with the Indigenous languages legislation. I was in the room when the Prime Minister promised that, and I've been in AFN meetings for the last 30 years. I've never seen a standing ovation like the one he had when he announced the Indigenous languages legislation. It's an important piece, but to this day, I haven't been consulted on it. And very few people have been consulted on. I haven't seen the draft legislation even on that, given its importance. So maybe we'll have to wait after another election, as usual.
We'll have to see. Again, another topic we can talk a lot about, but Mr. Miller, I want to give you the last word. Is this deadline unrealistic? A lot of people don't think this can be tabled before Christmas.
Look, as I said previously, this is something we're going to take the time to do right. We can't deny that that we are the only voice. We can't say that we're the only voice in the room. Clearly, we have to hear what's going on, hear from AFN, hear from stakeholders, hear from Mr. Saganash, Ms. McLeod. There are different. There's a wide range of views, and we have in about 16, 17 years, we'll have half a millennium of a frayed relationship. So to expect everything to happen in 4 years is unrealistic. Now, does that absolve us from moving the envelope forward? Absolutely not. And we do need to move it forward. Mr. Saganash knows how passionate I am about languages. I know his passion. I see it in every community. So I think you can see legislation that will be passed. We're co-drafting with AFN. Again, that legislation is one thing, and it's important, but there's a question of the fiscal arrangement as well. There's other nations involved as well.
I wish we had more time to talk about, but we don't. And I know you're passionate about it. I should point out to our audience that you actually did speak Mohawk in the legislature back in June of 2017.
Still a beginner.
But we're all out of time. Another break, and we'll be back shortly. Welcome back. Cannabis will become legal in less than 2 weeks. Despite that, it's questionable whether or not First Nations are ready. So last night, 2 cabinet ministers appeared before a Senate committee. Minister of Organized Crime Reduction, Bill Blair, and Indigenous Services Minister, Jane Philpott. They answered questions from senators about how the new legislation will impact Indigenous people. One of the issues that came up in committee was health and addiction problems coming out of legalization. Nunavut Senator Dennis Patterson pointed out his territory has no treatment centers.
Do you have a system in place to deal with applications and maybe prioritize areas that are currently underserviced, please?
So we have a number of smaller programs in a number of communities, and very much trying to support the kinds of things that you and I have talked about before in terms of supporting real grassroots community initiatives, because we often find that these are the most successful if they're designed by people who really understand the needs.
Discussion also revolved around whether First Nations will get a cut of the tax revenue generated.
Do you envision the kind of tax sharing revenue arrangement that we talked about as a committee as a possible outcome of these discussions with the First Nations Tax Commission and the Assembly of First Nations?
In the very short term, while there's still work being done to prepare for opportunities from a tax point of view, we're also seeing these really good opportunities for the economic development that comes with production facilities.
Senator Christmas also asked what jurisdiction First Nations will have to regulate the drug in their communities.
Given the federal framework, and if bylaw making powers are within that framework, then there is room to enable First Nations and other communities to exercise some bylaw making power on cannabis. Am I hearing correctly?
I believe where those bylaws are not inconsistent with the federal law. I think that there is an opportunity there. that, you know, that First Nations can exercise within their own jurisdictions bylaws to protect the health and safety of their kids and to regulate the activities of consumption and retail within their communities.
But Senator Mary Lou McPhedran asks whether jurisdiction extends to a complete ban on cannabis.
Discussed commonly in terms of what is the best approach to a healthy drug policy that will actually ensure that education is maximized and harms are minimized, and that sometimes banning substances has not been as successful as leaders have felt in a variety of experiences.
Join me now is Ottawa reporter Annette Francis. Now, Minister Philpott seemed to suggest they prefer First Nations not ban cannabis, but you went to the Nipissing First Nation and they have something similar about a ban, so tell us some details about that.
Well, yeah, we went to Nipissing First Nation in July for a visit. We did a couple of stories there, and we spoke to the chief about they put a moratorium in place. And they decided to put that in place back in April because due to the fact there were a number of First Nations that were already starting to set up dispensaries in their communities back then. So they decided they would put a moratorium in place, and because they weren't too sure about the safety of it, they wanted to educate themselves, and the community had concerns as well. So they put that in place as far as the sale, dispensaries on the reserve, and grow ops. They didn't want anyone growing marijuana on the reserve as well.
Is that something that they think that might reverse in the future?
Not anytime soon. He said they're just going to sit back. They're going to see how the community feels about it and look at the safety concerns. And he said not anytime soon.
On the other hand, you have visited several First Nations who are hoping to get on the cannabis bandwagon. They want some economic development about that. Again, tell us more about that.
Well, there are some Southern First Nations, Tyendinaga, Alderville. Alderville has, they call it the Green Mile. There's 9 or 10 dispensaries on one stretch of highway, the highway going through the reserve there, and they're doing well.
I think you said there was 50 of them.
Oh, that's in Tyendinaga.
Oh,
Tyendinaga is another hour away from Alderville, a little further, and they have over 50. I heard 53. We were there the other day, and they're popping up all over the place. And I talked to a few of the shop owners there. They say there's a lot of competition, but they're doing well. They're getting the bills paid. Some do better than others, depending on where they're at, but yeah, they're doing quite well.
Of course, this is before legalization even has happened. I imagine after the middle of October, it might even be better, more profits for them.
As far as the ones in Tyendinaga, yeah, they're saying October 17th does not affect them at all. They're sovereign, that they'll continue no matter what, and they'll keep going. They have done well as far as, they have gasoline, the tobacco, and now the marijuana dispensaries are doing well.
Well, thank you for that update, Annette.
Okay, thank you. Next
week, we're going to focus on the Indigenous Rights Initiative framework. It deals with developing nationhood and self-government, but what does that all really mean? If you missed any part of tonight's show, you can check out our podcast. Go to aptnnews.ca/podcast. I'm Todd Lamourant. Thanks for watching.